normal network communications, repackage it, rebox it into a box meant for public transport. We encrypt it so nobody can see inside that box. And because we've done that, it can be transported, that information is transported through a public network to the other side, who understands and has the special key to unlock the information and get it back out of that public transport box and have that nice, confidential, sensitive information still inside, untouched and unseen by others. I just described to you in a weird kind of personal way what a virtual private network is. Well, Alan, gosh, you made it sound so simple. I talked to somebody else. They started talking about tunneling and stuff. This idea of repackaging into a carrier box, which is basically re-encapsulation in network terms, is what we're doing. Is when I said before, we want to make our own private channel. Well, they're calling it a private tunnel, if you will. This is tunneling through a public network, creating your own channel. And really the channel isn't necessarily physical channel, but rather you've encrypted it in a way to where while it's on the public network, nobody can see what's in it. And it's only viewable once it gets unpackaged at the other side, at the other trusted network. So you're going to see that in a graphic here in a moment. So what do we see? The benefit, the business driver for this is a VPN is an effective technology for securing communications of remote external users, even though we share that common internet connectivity. And again, how does this work? Well, you see these two devices left and right that have keys on them. Those are our bastion hosts. In between those bastion hosts is the internet of untrusted network that we don't know, could be bad, could be suspicious. We don't know. We are distrustful of the internet communications between those bastion hosts. And if they sent open packets of information from one to the next as it traverses the road, that's kind of like the information being on a flatbed with no protective cover, and everybody can see your goodies. So if we don't want that, we need to encapsulate between those two bastion hosts. So it turns out in those blue boxes with the keys, we actually have firewalls that have the capability to take information, repackage it, encrypt it in a way that nobody can see inside of it, and then send it from one firewall to another through the internet. So think of it kind of like a container that's on the flatbed now. And you can see that the flatbed's carrying something. You just can't see what's in it. And essentially, so how it works is your internal user there at the IP address on the left of 172.16.1.254, they send clear text information in this easy, cozy, sensitive internal network to its bastion host, the firewall, who's connected to the internet. That bastion host says, hold on there. I'm going to repackage it. I'm going to encrypt it, put it in a container, send it on its way to the other side. As you notice, as it went through that tunnel, the bad hackers, they saw it go by but couldn't get into it. So consequently, it got over to the other side, who then decrypts it, sends it on into its own tender protected internal network as clear text. Why does it do this? So that way we don't have to have internal hosts going through all the work of encrypting and decrypting themselves. Moreover, if you want to be able to check to make sure your internal users aren't sending or receiving bad information, you don't want to let them encrypt and decrypt on your internal network, because that would protect their traffic from you inspecting it. Right? Privacy is good for me, just not for everybody else. That's essentially what those firewalls are saying. Now then, will you really need to know all of that stuff? Not deeply, but to a degree. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to have to know what protocol is used to do that. There are a variety of protocols that can do that, such as Layer 2 tunneling protocol, but we more commonly use something called IPsec. Oh, sounds technical. Yeah, just remember, VPNs, IPsec, that's your protocol. That's your number. Okay. Turns out IPsec has the ability to say, well, we could just hide the information and encrypt the data that's inside the container itself, leaving the original internal addressing on the outside of the container, even though so that way when it's on the flatbed, people wouldn't be able to see the data, but they would be able to see where the data was coming from and where it was going if they wanted to tear into it. Oh. Turns out that if you can encapsulate the payload itself without changing out the addressing information in the authentication headers. So you can use encapsulating secure payload to encrypt the data portion. And if you don't recreate and if you don't actually encrypt the original destination and source addresses, then they can see that. If you want to handle all of this, you could actually encrypt everything and just add on fresh addressing on the outside. And that is where we're using both authentication headers as well as encapsulating secure payload together in order to have full confidentiality of everything. Now then, IPsec with virtual private networks, they also prevent what we call man-in-the-middle attacks, where somebody says, I'm going to intercept the information and then create new information that I send on to the destination claiming to be the source. But since we're doing some authentication together with authentication headers, that prohibits that. So IPsec is a secure protocol for this. Why don't we just use that all the time? It requires more work to do all of this stuff, and that requires overhead. And for performance, the more overhead you have, the less speed you have. Good, fast, or cheap, any two of the three. So IPsec, again, tunnel mode versus transport mode. Transport mode encrypts only the data portion, the payload of each packet, leaving the IP header untouched. The more secure tunnel mode encrypts both the original IP header and payload, attaching a new IP address to the header. So again, then we can also use an authentication header to be able to prevent man-in-the-middle. So on the receiving side, an IPsec compliant device decrypts all of that incoming traffic, just like I showed you in the picture. What do you need to know for the test? The stuff that's boldfaced and italicized on these slides. That's what you need to know. To this day, ISACA still potentially has some questions about something we call remote access callback. All right, I'm going to lose some people here because, folks, we're now going to talk about back in the old days when a modem really was a modem, meaning that it modulated, demodulated electronic signals. That was, there used to be a company called Hayes Modems, and you could get this device that would use a plain old telephone system, a POT system, to call to another modem, and you would hear them negotiating and making all kinds of sounds before they established this unbelievably slow connection. We could actually do that using modems as basically trying to put a radio communication over the telephone system is essentially what it was doing. Wow. Well, here's the problem, is how do you authenticate that connection? One way was called remote access callback. And what that was is, hey, if a modem dials into me and wants to establish a point-to-point connection, I don't know who you are. You could be anybody. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to hang up on you and I'm going to call you back on the number you should be at. And that'll make sure that I'm only talking to the right other device. Of course, that can be also redirected today, we understand, with phone forwarding and things like this. But still, we had this mechanism in place called remote access callback with our modem connections. And you may still have some questions about this. This is really old. But nonetheless, you will now know how to answer these questions should you get them. You know what remote access callback is. That is described in the first bullet. And then you will also see that we also have a brute force attack control on this, where we will terminate after a specific number of unsuccessful attempts. We have network monitoring and tools. Again, as we have network devices connected to our network, what we call intrusion detection systems. They have intrusion detection sensors. They can detect potential malicious traffic. Well, the problem is that this can be vulnerable in that it's not tuned to be sensitive enough that it ends up not reporting malicious traffic. All right, well, here's the thing. If it doesn't report anything, it doesn't raise its hand and say, I have nothing to report. Oh, but I was wrong. Sorry about that. False alert. Even though that never happens, ISACA says installing a vulnerability assessment tool or a security scanner, such as an IDS, could result in false negative reporting, meaning no alert, but I was wrong. They don't send out no alerts. So it's just, again, I don't know. More what you're concerned about is they're tuned to be too restrictive, and they end up freaking out at everything and starting sending false positive alerts. And evidently somebody said, yeah, but that's too obvious. Let's turn it around and say, but it's also vulnerable to false negative alerts, even though it never sends a negative alert. It's their exam, not mine. But you're prepared for that question if you run into it. So when performing detailed network assessments, you also have to, of course, know where all your points of entry are, because that's where attacks could come through, and that's what you need to protect. Intrusion detection systems I already described. They identify attacks, penetration attempts on the network. They gather evidence on these attack attempts and so on and so forth. So a lot of these statements on this slide are just, again, relevant to IDS systems. Now, within IDS systems, there are two different kinds of IDS systems. One of them is network-based. It's going to be at your firewall. It's analyzing the traffic, trying to see, are you talking bad stuff in there? Are you trying to do malicious things? Do I see potential malicious commands in your traffic? And if so, I'm concerned. Network-based uses network-based IDS sensors to collect data from traffic. Host-based intrusion detection system is your McAfee and Norton that runs on your desktop, that's checking every application before it runs to make sure that it's the real application and it's not doing something malicious. That is why Norton and McAfee can have a pretty severe impact on the performance of your local computer, because it is mediating all of those application activities to make sure that nobody's doing anything fishy. When it's running on the device like that, that's host-based. When it's looking at traffic for potential malicious traffic, that's network-based. Which one is better? Neither. It'd be nice to have both, actually. So you need to know we have two types of intrusion detection implementations, network-based and host-based. Within those types, we have different methods. So whether you be network-based or host-based, you could be looking at things and comparing it against signatures that we talked about. Your antivirus is looking at antivirus definitions. Those are the signatures of what viruses look like. That's signature-based. So you could do that on host-based intrusion detection with antivirus. You can also use signatures of malicious traffic patterns on network-based intrusion detection. Getting away from signature-based, going on to behavioral-based, statistical anomaly-based, or we call it heuristic scanning. This is where we say, well, it's not a signature per se, but you're lurking. You're doing suspicious activity. You're trying to access things that I don't think you should be trying to access. So in other words, this is where you're having intrusion detection based upon suspicious patterns rather than known definitions. That's behavioral-based, statistical anomaly-based. Either one of these methods can be used within network-based. Either one of these methods can be used within a host-based type of IDS. Honeypots, I've already talked about before. We're going to make a very enticing, vulnerable system, so that way if somebody does get through our defenses, they'll see that enticing, vulnerable system that seems to be unprotected, and they'll be drawn to it like a bee to honey, and we will then be able to alert and monitor that attack and perhaps contain that attack before they get onto our real systems. There it is. That's essentially a honeypot. Network security vulnerability assessment. We have IDS systems cannot detect attacks contained within encrypted traffic. The most important, by the way, this goes to show again, if I'm trying to analyze potential malicious traffic and that traffic is encrypted because it went from client to client encryption rather than firewall to firewall encryption, that means the firewall wouldn't be able to inspect the insides of the packets. you could have client-to-client communication that's malicious, that can't be inspected at the firewalls, and that is potentially dangerous. This is why a lot of firewalls are configured that if someone does try to establish encrypted communication, direct communication with another client through the network, it will stop that. It's been specifically configured. Moreover, even if data is sent in an encrypted attachment, a lot of firewalls will drop it because they say, if I can't look inside of that zip file, I'm not going to let it through. And you encrypted your zip file, so I'm going to drop it. But it was legitimate. Doesn't matter. If I can't inspect it, it doesn't get through. Ladies and gentlemen, that is why, for example, when organizations encrypt their PDFs, it turns out the PDFs get dropped at the firewall. And that's why they can't be transmitted by email. So even an encrypted PDF might be stopped by a firewall. Because why? Because of this problem. Pardon me. So network security vulnerability assessments. Again, the difference between a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test is a penetration test goes beyond a vulnerability test to actually try to break something and see if it can happen. That's at least what ISACA says. Again, network infrastructure security, we need to make sure that we, they say, well, what if, remember when I said ISACA loves to ask questions where if you can't do the right thing for some reason, what's the next best wrong thing? They may say, well, you've got a small organization, doesn't have a lot of money, and they can't really do a lot of the right things. So if you can't have any of the right controls that you should have just because you're too small and cheap, what should you do instead? What's that doing on an exam? I don't know, but it is. And you would say, well, if you can't have any controls, I guess you better be watching everything very carefully. Yep, supervision of computer usage is the most effective procedure for security on a standalone, small business computer environment where they don't have much money. If you can't do the right thing, what's the next best wrong thing? ISACA exam. So, a server running, by the way, don't blame them necessarily, because like I said, they crowdsource a lot of these questions. So who knows where this came from? A server running data loss prevention, DLP software application. Again, it uses predefined criteria is your answer to check whether any confidential documents or data are leaving the internal network. Cryptography definitions. You need to know the difference between cryptography, which is encrypting things, versus cryptanalysis, which is unencrypting things, breaking the secrecy of cryptography. Types of ciphers. It turns out within encryption, we can have varying complexity of how we encrypt things. A simple cipher, a substitution cipher, is where we're, well, basically swapping one character for another. Examples of a substitution cipher include something known as the Caesar cipher or C3 cipher. It only used one single alphabet and it substituted one character for another. Polyalphabetic is where you're using multiple alphabets together in a substitution way. Transposition cipher is where you're not just replacing one character with another, but you're starting to swap and mix them around. That's using permutation. The characters are scrambled in addition to simple substitution. Steganography. You'll need to know terms definitions comparing one to the other. Steganography is where the message is not necessarily encrypted, but the message that they're hiding isn't known to the normal user. So remember what I talked about before? I could write information to the slack space that's been reserved for non-volatile RAM in a system. Even though you're not supposed to write there, it's still a hard drive and I could write there. Well, that's writing to a place that nobody's expecting to look. The more common example that you see with steganography is hiding a message within a photograph. And unless you know how to look at it in what way, you wouldn't see the message. So again, it's not encrypted per se. It's hiding in plain view is what it is. So an auditor reviewing digital rights management applications expects to find lots of watermarking, which would be an example of steganography. So symmetric versus asymmetric algorithms. Now we're getting into the encryption itself. Well, symmetric cryptography means that you only have one key. The key is used to encrypt things. The key is used to decrypt things. It's just like a padlock. You use one key to lock it. You use one key to unlock it. Same key. Because that one key can encrypt and decrypt, the problem is if you and I are going to use one key, I encrypt something with the key, you must have the same key to decrypt it. You encrypt something with the key, I must have the same key to decrypt it. That's all fine and well, but how did we get that one key from me to you in a way that she or he couldn't get it? This is the dilemma with symmetric, single key, shared key cryptography. Now then, ISACA does something that still persists to this day that kind of really is difficult. Remember when I said we need to keep that key secret? Because, well, gosh, if it got shared with other people, then they would have the one key that could encrypt and decrypt too. And then if they intercepted our traffic, it wouldn't protect us much. ISACA got confused once, and it says, which of the following ensures confidentiality of information transmitted over the internet? And you look through the different systems they offer, and you realize, wow, wait a minute, none of these apply. The closest one that applies, they call it a private key crypto system. Why do I have a problem with this? Because there's another crypto system that we're going to get into called public key cryptography. And if you have a public key, it turns out there is a corresponding private key. That means the term private key is a formal term that goes to a different kind of crypto system. So they messed up once, and instead of calling symmetric cryptography secret key cryptography, they called it a private key crypto system, which automatically I wanted to cast out because I said, there is no such thing as a private key crypto system, but there is a public key crypto system that uses private keys, but that's not what they're describing here. There is no such thing as a private key crypto system. And the first time I looked at it, I said, they're trying to trick me, but fortunately I know when to cast bad answers out. That doesn't even exist, leaving me to cast 4 answers out of 4 and wondering, what do I do now? This is where I got that. So again, it could be that even though a private key crypto system technically doesn't exist, they confuse it with secret key, and you'll just have to roll with that. The security level of a private key system, secret key system it should be, depends on the number of encryption key bits. In other words, encryption by the pound. Today we understand that a longer encryption key doesn't necessarily guarantee higher confidentiality because it's not just the size of your key, it's how you use it. But that's real world versus exam world. So we also go on and start talking about, again, symmetric key cryptography. If I encrypt something that you can decrypt, but you use the same key to encrypt that I can decrypt, that means we both have the same key. If we both share a key, it's like us both sharing a password. And if once it's shared between two parties, no one party can be held accountable for what was done while using that key, that password, if you will. So that means symmetric cryptography with its one shared key doesn't support the ability to hold people accountable, to keep them from repudiating activities. So symmetric cryptography, single shared key, secret key cryptography doesn't provide for non-repudiation. However, because it's simple, it's very fast. That's the advantage of symmetric key cryptography. All right, so we've got some of the characteristics in our mind about that. What kinds of symmetric algorithms exist? You may wonder, or you may just not wonder and know what to answer on your exam. Be ready to recognize Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES, as a symmetric encryption crypto system algorithm. Asymmetric cryptography, well, it's called asymmetric because the reverse of one works for the other. What they did is they came up with key pairs. I can encrypt something one way with this key. We make a reverse copy, an asymmetric copy of this key that then can decrypt anything encrypted by its pair copy. So that means that if I have two keys, one locks the lock and one unlocks the lock. Yes. Turns out I can also lock the lock with this one, but if I do, even this one won't unlock it. I have to use the other one. They have an inverse relationship, okay? And that's why it's called key pairs. Public-private keys are used, and we call it public key cryptography, even though there's a private key in there, okay? So asymmetric cryptography, remember, it doesn't have a single shared secret key. It has two keys, not one, but two. Those key pairs are inversely related. That's why they're called asymmetric. One key encrypts, the other key decrypts. So here's how it works. Remember before when I said if we have a single shared key and it gets intercepted by someone else, well, then we won't have confidentiality because anybody could intercept our traffic and decrypt it. How do we get information from here to there without sharing a key across an untrusted network? Here's how it works. You're going to go get your own unique key pair, either create one yourself or get one from a public provider like Veritas or something like this. I have a key pair different from your key pair. We now have 4 unique keys total. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, look, if you ever want to send me something private, here's the key to do it with. Encrypt it with this key. And I give you one of my keys. And matter of fact, I give that to anybody. Because why? Because it's only used by others to encrypt something to send it to me. And if you or anybody else sends something to me, I'm the only person in this whole world that has the corresponding key that will decrypt it. You never share that other key ever? No, I keep it very, very private. Matter of fact, I'm going to say this key that I gave to you, that I give to everybody, that's the one for public use. And this other key that I keep to myself that I never share with anybody, that's going to be my private key, my own special private key. I will never share it with anybody. So essentially, when I give out my public key, I'm giving open locks to everybody, and they can lock something down. And once locked, even they can't decrypt it. Because why? They don't have my private key. I never share that. So by doing this,